Chapter 18, Carl Boyles. Carl Boyles hadn't paid much attention to the staff changes that Warden Matthews was making. Besides trying to help Thomas Little get documents that would help prove he didn't belong to the hothouse, Boyles was busy with his prison job. It was Associate Richard Warden Smith who had hired Boyles to look after a patch of grass outside the hospital about the size of a tennis court. Smith had known Boyles nearly 20 years, and he had created the groundskeeping crew just for him. You got to treat someone who has been down as long as Carl Boyles differently from some kid fresh from the streets, Smith explained. It was just not kindness that moved Smith to pay Boyles $50 per month from a special discretionary account in his office. Smith wanted the troublesome Boyles somewhere out in the open where he could be easily watched. Much to Smith's delight, Boyles had always taken the job seriously. He was constantly pulling weeds and planting flowers. Boyles nursed his tulips and morning glories with such care that the guards began calling the triple murder a flower child. Smith was so pleased that he allowed Boyles to plant a small garden in one corner of the lot just for himself. He also arranged for Littles to work with Boyles. A few weeks before Smith was scheduled to leave Leavenworth to take up his promotion, Boyles stopped him and the warden Matthews as they walked past the hospital. He needed wood chips for his flower beds, Boyles explained, and he needed them immediately. Later that day, Matthews mentioned Boyles' request during his daily afternoon meeting with his executive staff. Boyles is beginning to act like he's one of us, Matthews said good-naturedly. The way he fusses about how the flowers look, we're going to have to start calling him Lieutenant Boyles. Everyone in the room chuckled, but there was one associate warden who found the remark quite troubling. Lee Connor didn't like Carl Boyles and didn't think he should be getting special treatment, nor did Connor get along well with Richard Smith. As soon as Smith left Leavenworth, Connor became the new associate warden for custody, and one of the first things he did was to visit the east yard where Boyles and Thomas Little were tending flowers. "What is it?" Boyles asked when he saw Connors approaching. "I'm not happy," Connor replied coolly. "I'll send someone around to tell you about it." Lieutenant Tracy Johns appeared about an hour later. "The garden has to go," Johns said bluntly. "What?" Boyles replied, but Johns simply shrugged. It was an order from Connor. "No more personal gardens, period," Johns said. Boyles and Little began ripping out the seeds, tossing them into the trash container. 4 years later, Connor again strolled into the east yard to make certain the garden was gone. Boyles and Little scowled at him as they leaned against the wall of the hospital smoking cigarettes. An hour later, Lieutenant Johns appeared with another order from Connor. "You have both been fired," said Johns. Carl Boyles' face was blood red as he stormed back to his cell. Before Boyles was notified of his firing, a lieutenant had told him what was going on, and I was waiting near Boyles' cell when he and Little came up the tier. "The man didn't have the decency to fire me himself," Boyles said, his face filled with hatred. "I know what he's doing. He's pissing on me because he and Dick Smith didn't get along." Little scrambled to fix Boyles a Coca-Cola. He hurried down the tier to get ice, poured Boyles his drink, and climbed onto the top bunk where he sat silently as Boyles continued to complain. "I'm 47 years old," said Boyles, "and during all my life, Dick Smith is the first person who ever gave me anything to be responsible for. Look around. The guards tell me when to eat, when to sleep, even when I can take a shit. What have I got to be responsible for in here? Not a damn thing. Do you know I've never lost a tool out there? In 3 years, I've never taken advantage of the trust that Dick Smith showed me. I worked my ass off because I wanted to show that I could be responsible. Good old Carl Boyles, that worthless piece of shit, could actually be responsible. And what did all that hard work mean to these people? Nothing. Connor just blows in and fires me." At that point, Boyles wanted a cigarette. Little hopped off the bunk. "I'll get him, Carl," he volunteered. "I took human life, and that was a bad thing, a terrible thing," Boyles said as he inhaled, somewhat calmer. "But I have spent 23 fucking years of my life in prison. Doesn't that count for something? Is there some redeemable value in me? If not, what the fuck is the point in all this? If all this is meaningless, why not take me out to the city dump, hit me in the head with a hammer, and leave me there with the garbage? You could have done that, but you see, society didn't. Oh my, society said, all my life is precious. Why, even Carl Boyle's life is worth rehabilitating. So society put me in here under a correctional officer who I assume is supposed to correct my behavior. Little laughed. Boyle shot him an angry look. Little stopped chuckling. I'm the asshole in here, right? Boyles continued. You put me in this madhouse for 23 fucking years. You put me in here with a bunch of fools who are more demented than I am, and then you send me in with even bigger fools to guard us. Every day I have to deal with society's scum. Every day I have to deal with guards who are complete idiots. There is a guard working right now on this tier who comes in here every day pissed off because his old lady is fucking some other guy. That's not my fault. I ain't fucking his old lady, but I have to deal with his anger. I have to adjust for his moods. I got no choice. Yet you expect me to respect this guy because he's a correctional officer. Bullshit. And then one day Dick Smith shows up, and he is a halfway reasonable and intelligent man, and he says, Carl, I want you to take care of these flowers. Keep it pretty. It's not much. Listen, I know it's just a fucking flower bed, but it's my fucking flower bed. He gives me something to be responsible for, something I can do to prove that, yes, I may be a no good motherfucker, but I can at least take care of flowers. And I don't care. Quite frankly, if the fucking director of the Bureau of Prisons walks down here and says, Boyles, I took your flowers because I'm the director and I don't think we need flowers anymore, I'd say, well, there is no doubt in my mind that you can do that, and you have done it. But it don't mean a fucking thing to me, not in my heart, because you can't make it right. Boyle stopped talking. For several minutes, we sat in silence. All you could hear were noises outside the cell. An inmate shouted down the tier, hey man, check that dryer. See if my laundry's done. Fuck you, man. Check it yourself. Think I'm your fucking maid? Came the reply. Another inmate walked past reading a letter he had just received. Someone opened the door to the television room, and for a few seconds the screams of Bon Jovi escaped from MTV. Elsewhere, life inside the prison was going on as normal, but inside this cell, time had stopped. Little looked down from his bunk at Boyles, but the older convict didn't respond. He sat on a metal chair in the center of the cell, drained of emotion. There was an uneasy silence. It was impossible to tell what Boyles was thinking. The cell that Boyles and Little shared in the newly remodeled A cell house was unique because the afternoon sun actually fell inside it. On this particular day, the sunlight struck Boyle's stubble face, giving it a jaundiced look. He appeared tired and old. The cell was one of the neatest that I had seen. The magazines on the metal locker were not simply stacked together. They had each been turned face up and their edges were flush. The sheets and blankets on the bunk beds had been pulled tight, military fashion. Both men's shoes and slippers were lined up as if they had been placed there by a maid. There were 2 bulletin boards on the wall, and both contained the obligatory new pinups. But Little's board was dominated by an intricate pencil drawing that, he explained later, was a diagram of a futuristic atomic fallout shelter that he had drawn. Boyles had a drawing too. It showed a man on his knees, his hands tied behind his back. The man's head had been sliced off by a sword. Boyles had drawn blood dripping from the neck. See, the truth is that when society sent me here, it really didn't think my life was important, Boyles said. The truth is, you bastards just didn't have the nuts to hit me in the head with that hammer and throw me in the dump. You put me in here and you wrote me off. You said, don't ever let this motherfucker out, and that ain't right. If you want to fuck me, come in here and say, Carl, we're going to fuck you, and there's nothing you can do about it. But don't lie to me. Don't tell me my life is worth saving. Don't tell me what I do in here matters when the truth is no one really gives a shit what I do. Whether I act good and take care of those flowers or fuck up and start stabbing people, the truth is no one really gives a fuck. Cause to the outside world, I'm dead and you folks are never going to let me out. By the next morning, Boyles had cooled off. Do you know how many wardens have come and gone since I've been here? He asked. Look, these people have caused me to bounce off the walls long enough. I'm never touching another flower again for these motherfuckers. I asked Connor later that day about his decision to fire Boyles, and he quickly assured me that it had nothing to do with his personal clashes with Richard Smith. No other inmates are allowed to have their own private gardens. Why should Carl Boyles get one? Maybe Dick Smith felt comfortable with that contradiction, but I don't. Connor continued, Boyles was referring to certain tools as my tools. I was hearing people, including the warden, referring to Boyles as Lieutenant Boyles. Comments like that mean something in here. Our environment dictates that an inmate and correctional officer will never be friends. We have to live on separate sides of the street. Even though people were joking about Boyles being a lieutenant, he was beginning to cross that street. Officers were letting their guard down. I told Connor about Boyles' reaction, his speech about responsibility, how much he enjoyed the garden. Connor chuckled. What you got to realize about someone like Carl Boyles is that there is always an ulterior motive. The reason he had that garden was not because he liked gardening, but because he was using it as some part of a scheme. Maybe he was using it to hide dirt from a tunnel he was digging. Maybe he was hiding a shank there. Maybe he was simply growing himself a tomato to sell. I can't tell you, but I know Boyles, and I know he was up to something. The bottom line is that I decided it was time for Mr. Boyles' world to come crashing in on him, said Connor. With someone like Boyles, it's good to shake them up every once in a while and remind them of where they are and who is in charge. Connor's statement sounded harsh. What people from the outside world don't understand, he quickly added, is that inside here, convicts put on their best face because they want people to feel sorry for them. You see them in a cell, and you can imagine yourself in that cell, and you feel awful about it. But you got to remember that Carl Boyles killed 3 people simply because he wanted them dead, and you will never convince me that you can change a Carl Boyles. If I were the judge in the chair, I wouldn't care if Carl could be rehabilitated, because what he did is so heinous that there is just one payment, either death or to keep him away from people forever, period. You sure as hell aren't going to find me shedding tears because Carl Boyles lost his vegetable garden. Now that Boyles and Little were out of work, they began spending more time in recently remodeled hothouse exercise room. Warden Matthews had purchased several new stationary bicycles, weight benches, and other equipment for the inmates. Boyles had signed a weightlifting program for Little. He was schooling him in other ways as well. Carl opened my eyes to things I'd never seen and most people never see in here, Little explained one afternoon. You look around, the guards look around, and everyone thinks they know what's going on, but they don't really see shit. Believe me, Carl sees things going on that you can't even imagine. In the short time that they had been cellmates, Boyles had already shown Little several scams. A few cells down the tier from their cell was a convict-run store where inmates could buy soft drinks, cigarettes, crackers, fruit, pornography, and even jogging suits. It was against bureau regulations for convicts to stockpile goods from the prison commissary in their cells and then barter or sell them to other inmates. But stores like this could be found on nearly every tier at the hothouse. They were frequented by inmates because the commissary was only open a few hours each day. There was always a long line of customers waiting to get in, and inmates were prohibited from spending more than $105 per month. Moreover, the commissary didn't give anyone credit. Convict-run stores were always open, there were never lines, there was no limit on spending, and most gladly offered credit. That was because the stores charged 100% interest. If an inmate took a can of Coke on credit, he owed the store 2 cans of Coke the next very day. Most convict-run stores were run by clerks who worked for a backer. It was the backer's job to put up enough money to stock the store and, more importantly, supply the muscle when an inmate didn't pay. The clerk took the risk of getting arrested by the guards for operating a business, although guards rarely bothered them unless a convict got too greedy and stockpiled his cell with so many items that it became obvious what he was doing. In those cases, most guards would step in because they didn't want to run the risk of being chastised by a lieutenant or captain who happened to notice that the inmate's cell was overflowing with goods. Boyles had pointed out various prison bookies, explained which gangs controlled the drugs, and told Little about the male prostitutes who charged a carton of cigarettes for sex. These were all small scams, and most guards knew as much about them as the inmates did. Occasionally, a guard would bust a convict for some minor offense, but in Boyles' eyes, these routine, petty crimes were inconsequential. But extortion, contract murders, major drug smuggling, and escape plots were serious, and Boyles prided himself on being able to spot them long before other inmates or the guards did. One morning, he pointed out a fish to Little and predicted that someone would soon make a move on the fat white middle-aged convict who had been sent to prison for bilking investors out of several $1,000,000 through a land fraud scheme. Just as Boyles had predicted, 2 DC blacks were arrested by the guards a few days later for trying to extort money from the inmate. They had pushed him down a flight of stairs and threatened to kill him unless he paid $50 per week. The inmate had rushed to the lieutenant's office and spilled his story to the guards. The 2 DC blacks were put in a hole, and their victim was moved into a special cell block over the prison hospital known as the Protective Custody Unit, where weak inmates, snitches, and sexual deviants were housed for their own safety. It was a classic example, Boyles told Little, of how not to extort someone. Even a mouse is going to fight if you push him into a corner, Boyles lectured. You gotta understand that if a guy's weak, he's always going to take the easiest way out of a situation. The guy ran to the cops. The trick to orchestrating a successful scam, Boyles continued, was in thinking 3 moves ahead, like a chess player. You gotta get him to go where you want him to go. One day at lunch, Boyles pointed to an unlikely pair of inmates sitting together at a nearby table. One was a bearded, long-haired former biker and convicted killer. The other a thin, clean-shaven man in his mid-30s. Boyles explained that the biker was being paid to be the thin man's bodyguard. It seems the 2 men had arrived at Leavenworth a few months earlier aboard the same bus, and while they were being held on the fish tier, they became friends. Most nights, the biker stopped by the other man's cell just to chat. A short time after both were released into the main prison population, 2 thugs burst into the thin inmate's cell, knocked him to the floor, put a knife to his throat, and told him that they were going to rape him. As they were pulling off his pants, the biker came along for one of his nightly visits and scared off the thugs. The terrified younger man realized that he needed someone to protect him, so he hired the biker. Each week, the thin inmate's brother, who owned a small manufacturing plant in the Midwest, deposited a check into a savings account for the biker. What few inmates knew was that the biker, whom Boyles had known off and on for years, had paid the 2 thugs to terrorize the man. During one of their first conversations, the thin inmate had foolishly mentioned that his brother was a successful businessman, and from that moment on, the biker had looked for a way to extort money from him. You see, he gave the mark someplace to run, a way out of the corner, and the mark did exactly what he was supposed to do, Boyles explained. When Little first met Boyles, the seasoned convict promised to tell him the secret of being able to walk around in the hothouse without being victimized. This is what Boyles said. You got to learn how to draw a line. If some guy insults you every time you step out of your cell, first you got to ask yourself, is it me? Have I done something to deserve this disrespect? If you haven't done anything, then you know he is trying to run over you, and you must take it to him immediately. Get right in his face. Hey, what the hell is going on in here? Are you trying to fuck me? What is your problem, man? Look, we both got numbers in there, and hey, I'm willing to move halfway for you, but you have to move halfway for me. Now, if you ain't willing to do that, motherfucker, then you won't be on this tier much longer. That is all you have to do, because that is what is reasonable. But you drew a line, and if you aren't willing to draw that line and tell that motherfucker that you will make him pay if he crosses it, then you got no principles. You got no standing in here. You got no word, and you got no credibility. Boyles had never read any books by Wall Street tycoons on the art of deal making, but he understood raw power. The only time a guy is going to pull up, he explained, is if he thinks fucking with you is going to cost him more than he will have to gain. I've never had to stab another man in prison, Boyles continued, and I ain't no beefed up big motherfucker, but I've always made it perfectly clear that if you try to hurt me or kill me, I'm not going to hesitate. I'm going to walk into one of those prison factories, and I'm going to get myself a big hatchet, and I'm going to walk right down the center tier, right down the hall, and no one at all is going to try to stop me unless he's a complete idiot. I will cut off your head with that axe, and I'll pay whatever consequences society demands. But there should never be the slightest fucking doubt in anyone's mind that I will do that, ever. Boyles made it sound simple, and for him, it was.